following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
My baby dolls, we are back again, another episode of Genesis. As always, I am your host, Ian Kahanowitz, tonight. And you know, it is a night, because normally I record in the day. Tonight we have a great show, and it's one of those issues that really, take hold of me. This is going to be a very special show. We have three recurring guests that have previously been on my shows. We got the great Jimmy Driscoll, who is a former Major League Baseball player. He played with those swinging A's, with Reggie and Catfish and Campanera and all of them, Raleigh Fingers. And I had the great chance to meet him back in September. We met up in New Hampshire. Both of us drove about 2.5 hours. The stories he could tell, you could just write a book on it, and maybe one day we'll get a book out. Great guy. He is one of these 900 that were denied the pension plan. And again, my network has picked this issue up, and what we're talking about is the pre-1980 pension plan, where Grebe, who was the negotiator for the magnates and the owners, and, of course, Marvin Miller, who was head of the Major League Baseball's Players Union, were hammering out a collective bargaining agreement, and thus tried to prevent a strike. It ended up happening the next year, but basically what happened was there was a deal cut. Grebe did not want compensation for free agency. Miller consented. The problem was Grebe was thinking about the younger players and free agencies to prevent it. Miller might have softened his stance a little bit on this issue. The big problem was the pension plan that they agreed on was not retroactive. And so what happened was there was these new rules that were put into place, and the new rules gave people who, Major League Baseball players, anyone who goes into Major League Baseball one day is entitled to a lifetime health insurance. 43 days, which is a quarter of a season. If you play 43 games, you are entitled to a pension for the rest of your life. Problem is, those from 1947 and 1980 were not included in this agreement, and all of them were left out. And we're going to get to it very shortly. We also have Doug Gladstone on the line, and he has been crusading for these guys for about a decade now. Been a cup of coffees. His book, great book, folks. Holidays are coming. You got to go out and get it. If there is an injustice in Major League Baseball, and there are many, this is one of the biggest. Hey, we got also Professor Ed Edmonds, who is a professor emeritus at Notre Dame, and him and fellow Professor Frank Hudick, they were on my show back in September. Baseball Meets the Law. What do you know? Another great book. Go out, get it. Holidays are coming. Anyone who likes baseball law and wants to know what's going behind the scenes besides what's on the diamond, these two books will keep you preoccupied through the cold winter months into spring training. These are books not to just read. They are to be studied. They are that important to the game. As always, we're on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network, and with the Ralph Tycho, the Zigzag Man, we are expanding. Shows are expanding. We got Peter Golenbach, Hal Bach, Mark Littell. We are just growing by leaps and bounds, and I am humbled to be on this network with such great folks, great baseball minds. And every day I say, look, I'm blessed. I get to speak to Brett Boone. Spoke to Bob Boone the other day, his dad. He was a representative for the Philadelphia Phillies throughout the 70s, and in 1981 when he was on California, he represented the Angels in that strike-shortened season. I'm truly blessed that I get folks like Professor Edmonds and Doug Gladstone and Jimmy Driscoll on my show, because I really do think that you folks ought to know what's really going on out there. And hey, let's face it, I don't have to answer to the FCC, so I can say whatever I want. But with that, let me introduce to you Jimmy Driscoll, Doug Gladstone, and Professor Ed Edmonds. How are you folks tonight?
Doing well.
Very well.
All right, we got a power-packed show. We got all the big shots from the baseball world and at least theory. We start with Jimmy Driscoll. Jimmy, 1972. Spring training's coming up. There's talk of a strike. What did you do during the strike, and how were you preparing, and why would people follow Marvin Miller and not get paid?
That's the $64,000 question. I'm dating myself by mentioning that show, but glad to be back, Ian, with you, and glad to be in the same voice shot of Doug Gladstone. I met Doug up in New Hampshire here at a book signing a few years back when his book first came out, and Doug, and I want to thank you personally for certainly a labor of love that you're doing for us players that were, it's for lack of a better word, injustice paid to us. We were dues paying members of the union, and in our era, the minimum time frame to be in the majors was 4 years, but all that changed, as Ian just mentioned, in 1980, where the rules changed. But in the hurry and the confusion to get the thing signed, sealed, and delivered, they neglected to make it retroactive. But I want to thank you, Doug, personally for all your efforts. I get all your emails. I got one today, and the title was "Another One Bites the Dust." A player that. And they continue to fall off. I don't know how many we started with this group, but I guess it's down to around 400 now. And the theme is the old Queen song, title of the Queen song, "Another One Bites the Dust." And with dying, there goes any money that they were getting. It doesn't go to their spouse or to their loved ones. So, but getting back, that's my intro. But getting back into your original question, 1972, I'm in spring training with the Oakland Athletics, and we're in Arizona, Mesa, Arizona, and all of a sudden, I'm a kind of a rookie around the big league camps. I've been involved for a while, but as far as big league camps are concerned, I was, I'd worked my way up and put myself in a position to make a ball club. But meanwhile, this guy comes in, Marvin Miller was his name, and he was the head of the fledgling union, the Baseball Players Association union, in its early days, and he was formed together as a major league unit. And to tell you, the higher paid players were reluctant to sign up because they were sitting pretty already. Where the young guys like me were, had to have a job in the off season to make ends meet. But as it eventually came around, the union became stronger and stronger. And Big Frank Howard was a teammate of mine, and he was the player rep for the Washington Senators in those days. And he mentioned to us, he said, "Listen, fellas, in a meeting to take a vote on if we were going to go on strike," he said, listen, fellas, once they give you the pink slip, that's the walking papers, once they give you the pink slip, they don't pay you. They'll forget about you no matter what you've done. So we have to bond together. We did. And so for the life of me, especially with Tony Clark now ahead of the union, and a lot of the players that are being kind of hosed, for lack of a better term, Tony Clark played with, teammates with some of those years that he was playing ball. And for not to have him, when he got in there, we figured this is it. Our guy's in town. Well, our guy isn't in town. He's out of town. And and shame on him. Shame on Tony Clark. I mean, give us courtesy of getting back to us with some kind of explanation, if there is one. I don't think there is. But anyway, with that salvo, I'll let Doug jump in and say a few words, and I'll wait in the background if I feel like jumping in about the topic. I will. And pleasure to be on the show with you guys.
You got the floor, Doug.
Well, first of all, I'm very touched, Jimmy, that you would be so gracious in your kind remarks, and I thank you very much. You know, Ian said I'm on a crusade. I don't want anyone to think that I'm on that I'm wearing a white knight and I'm on a steed and I'm doing like Don Quixote. I'm just a baseball fan. Yes, albeit I'm a writer and a publicist. But men like yourself and David Clyde and George Historic Theodore and Carmen Fanzone and Steve Grilly, you were my boyhood heroes, heroes of my youth. And I personally think that, it's one thing to have a union that, let's face it, unions by and large support the working men and women of this country, the working families of this country, and most unions do phenomenal work. This union, as Mike Caldwell, the runner-up in 1978, the Cy Young race, and he won 2 games in the 1982 World Series. He only told me this yesterday. He said, I was a part of the greatest union in the world when I was a player. But when I'm a retiree, they don't know from anything. And I'm sure the good professor will explain, that unions don't owe anyone the duty of fair representation. Once a man has ceased paying dues, they don't have to represent them. But I understand that. And I understand that, as a labor economist, the great Marvin Miller, and believe me, I hope he does get into the Hall of Fame one day. I understand that a labor economist like him has to be concerned with his dues-paying members first and foremost. But I also understand one thing. You're going to be a retiree way longer than you're going to be a dues-paying active member of a union. So it's just smart business. And it's just, being a nice person to want to extend players, retirees, such as yourself, a little bit more than what they did in April 2011 when this ridiculous formula that had to be computed by an actuary went into effect of $625 per quarter for every 43 game days of service credit. And Ian, if I could just inform your listeners, it's not 43 games that you appeared in. It's 43 game days of service. All you have to do is sit your butt on a bench. Let's say, Ian, you're a call-up on August 15th and you never take a glove out to the field, you never swing a bat, you never come up to the plate, you never pinch run. You just sit your keister on the bench. You're the 25th man riding the pines. From about April 15th to September 30th, you will get a pension. It may not be a great pension, but currently, a post-1980 player who satisfied those requirements of at least 43 game days worth of credit is reportedly getting a pension of $34,000 a year. Now, I understand, again, the dues-paying members, for a union boss like Tony Clark, he has to care about them first and foremost. But let's face it, gentlemen, this is a $12 to $13 billion industry. And as men like Jimmy, who went out on labor, on picket lines, who endured labor stoppages, as Jimmy himself just said, they were the ones who ushered in free agency so that a man like Clayton Kershaw, and by the way, I don't begrudge him making $31.17 million this year. What I think is abhorrent is that the players' union doesn't want to divvy up more of the collective pie. Because what they're paying to men like Jimmy, we hope Jimmy's around for a long time, but when Jimmy passes, that pittance, that bone he was thrown, passes with him. It's not a true, people want to call it a pension, it's not. A pension is what you can designate to a loved one, to a spouse, to a beneficiary. If the men who are running MLB, if Rob Manfred and Pat Courtney and Tony Clark at the union and his lackey, Steve Rogers, who, by the way, I don't know if anyone knows this, maybe Jimmy does, Sal Bando was the AL representative during those Memorial Day weekend 1980 talks, and you know what? Who was the NL representative? It was Steve Rogers. So, I don't know. I'm not a psychologist, but maybe he realizes his mistake, and to save face, he has been a hardliner these last 37 years. But all MLB and the union have to do is give men like Jimmy, do away, throw it to the curb, let it go by the wayside, this ridiculous actuarial computation they came up with in April 2011. Give each man $10,000 a pop. Let that payment go for perpetuity so that a loved one could receive it. You know what that would cost? There were only 500 of the Jimmy Driscolls left. We're only talking about $5 million. In the economics of this sport, of our national pastime, gentlemen, that's chicken feed. That's chump change. And again, I cannot stress enough, I do not know how Tony Clark looks at himself in the mirror every morning, the audacity that he benefited from free agency, because, he was a great first baseman for the Detroit Tigers, but he played for a lot of teams. San Diego, the New York Yankees, the New York Mets. Tony Clark benefited from free agency because of the Jimmy Driscolls, because of the David Clydes, and the audacity of Tony Clark not wanting to help the men who paved the way for him and the current players to make what a lot of people would consider ridiculously obscene money. I've got to tell you, gentlemen, if you can tell me why Tony Clark doesn't want to part with $5 million when this sport is worth $12 to $13 billion, it's a head scratcher. You're smarter than me. And, I'll gladly take your questions later, but I'd love to hear what the good professor has to say about all of this.
You got the stage, Professor Edmonds.
Well, it is, I agree that it is perplexing, and that the amount of money that would be required to do an honorable thing for the players of that particular era who created the foundation on which the economics of the game for players today was made. It is perplexing to me. I must also admit that I'm perplexed by the way minor league baseball players are treated because they're outside of the union. And it seems to me over all the years that I've studied the union, and this was alluded to earlier, in the collective bargaining process, they're really focused on the current players. That seems to be the trend in all the team sports. I'm not sure that I could say that it seems to be the same way in a lot of other industries, in part because the sports industry is very different in the sense that most individuals are not going to be making money as a baseball player for an extended period of time. The average lifespan of a player is short, and this is not like somebody in the carpenters union or the plumbers union that could work for many, many years. So the thing that I've found interesting, even going back to the 70s and the 80s, is that it seemed many, many times that the Players Association, and I give the credit for the Players Association doing a lot of things that created free agency. Without that, players would still be treated miserably the way I think minor league players are treated, that they often didn't think of the players who created the foundation for all of this, for which there wouldn't have been any fan base, there wouldn't have been any media revenue, TV money, things, radio money, things like that they could do this. But after reading the book, and it's poignant what has happened. Players like Jimmy, and I understand now maybe there's only 500 left, so why not do the honorable thing? They're not legally required to do this, but in an industry that's revenues have grown so dramatically in the last decade, to not do something for these players who are, I think, rightfully embittered that the game could have done something more, and just for whatever reason not. I mean, the book details a lot of people when asked said, well, I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to get involved. I don't think that it would have hurt any of the players of the last 2 or 3 decades who, at least as long as they, played and they made money that none of the other players of the pre-80 era were able to make in the game because of the way it was structured. And owners made a lot of money, but the players didn't. So I'm perplexed as well. I would think that they could step up and do something, but it appears that at every turn of late, both the management of the union and of Major League Baseball have decided that they don't want to be concerned about this group when I think it would be a great sign, particularly I think for someone like Jimmy who, were there and went on strike. So we're not necessarily talking about players prior to 1965 when the union was just a house union, shall we say, not even legal under the NLRA, the National Labor Relations Act. That these are players who actually showed the solidarity during the period from about 1968 to 1975 when free agency was created and changed the leverage. And it seems to me that the biggest problem is that they don't have any leverage. So, yeah, if you say, once I retire, nobody's interested in me anymore, that seems to plague this union to the same extent that it does others as well.
Let me ask you something, Professor. In 1997, and it's documented in Mr. Gladstone's book, look, Negro League players, they were never allowed into Major League Baseball. They got a chunk of change, which, could be on its face looked like a pension plan. Now, they sue they sue the Major League Baseball. Lawyers take it to court saying, "Oh, you're discriminating against those who didn't play. This is a pension plan." Major League Baseball comes back saying, no, they were never employees. This is a charitable gift. So there's no discrimination here. We're not favoring black players over anybody who was an employee of Major League Baseball. There's no discrimination. You guys got African Americans on your thing here. There's no distinction. This is a charitable gift. Now let me ask you this question. Let's define the ERISA doctrine. And can ERISA, because Ronald Dean, an attorney in California, says, look, it's perfectly permissible to make an amendment retroactive if there was a mistake. And I got the ERISA stuff up on my computer now. And obviously with Marvin Miller and when he had to work with Greeby, this was an oversight. And let me ask, Doug, you had the chance to speak to Marvin Miller. Do you think it was an oversight? Do you think it was a mistake?
Well, look, I had the great good fortune to speak to the late Mr. Miller on Veterans Day of 2009. And I put the question to him. And, it's my word against that of a dead man. So people can take it with a grain of salt, or they can choose to believe me. And Mr. Miller said, look, if I had to do it all over again, of course I would do it differently. That's it in a nutshell. He admits he made a mistake. Okay.
Because that's important. Because in ERISA, that allows to amend the pension. Now let me ask you, Professor, I want you to define ERISA for us. I want to know if ERISA applies to Major League Baseball, and I want to know, can we amend these things? If we can amend it, do you think these guys have a long shot for a lawsuit? And also, the 900 folks that were left out, like Doug alluded to before, look, there's nothing in perpetuity. Can we get perpetuity on the books for those deceased employees of Major League Baseball, and can we get it now for the living as well?
Listen, I just want to, before the professor answers that,
yep.
I'd like to jump right in if I could.
Good.
I threw out this financial number of it would only cost $5 million. Now that's a modest drop in the bucket, as I alluded to. What I think the problem here is, and this, if I was Tony Clark, I'd be petrified of it too. Let's say, because as Commissioner Manfred himself says in my book, you can restore these men back to pension coverage, but it can only be done in, collective bargaining negotiations and, of course, a lawsuit. But let's say Tony Clark seriously entertains the idea of restoring these men to pension retroactivity coverage. Let's say you give them, moving forward, $34,000. That's reportedly what every man who, played post-1980 receives at the minimum. $34,000 a man for perpetuity will cost $17 million. Okay, I still think that's affordable, but obviously it's $12 million more than $5 million. The problem, and I'm giving Tony Clark, an out here. He can agree with this. The problem is what happens when you get a hardliner like David Clyde, who very freely says, I want 37 years of retroactive payments of $34,000 each. Well, that's a one-time check of $1.258 million, and collectively, that's $619 million. So if I'm Tony Clark, I'm scared of that. I'm scared of having to go back and lose $619 million a year. It's therefore in his best interest to play it on the cheap and part with only $10,000 a year per man. And again, there is more than ample precedence, as Jimmy and Ian know, Professor. You probably do as well. Yes, the Negro League veterans were receiving in 1997 $7,500 to $10,000 a year, and then in 2004, because Major League Baseball was found not to have been totally integrated until Pumpsie Green of the Boston Red Sox got on that team, an additional 89 men were allowed to choose between $40,000 for 4 years or $350 a month for life. Now do the math. $350 a month for the year is what? $4,200. That's still more than Jimmy Driscoll is getting this year. And Jimmy, as Ian correctly said, had a contractual employment relationship with the league, which the veterans of the Negro Leagues did not. And one other thing, Ian, let's not forget, the pre-1947 players, those individuals who, like Dolph Camilli, used to argue, what are you saying, our contributions aren't important just because we played prior to the establishment of the Players' Pension Fund in April 1947. Even they got $10,000 a year. So why this group is being singled out, I don't know. And I'm sorry I interrupted you.
It's all right. You got the stage, Professor. It's all yours.
As far as I know, they certainly could make an amendment, and I think, Doug, your point is well made that their concern might be over what these players could come back and say they want. If David Clyde says, look, you need to make up all the missed years. I don't know that legally they would be forced to do that. And if their decision is, gee, if I open up the door to that possibility, that's troubling in the way certain pension funds have had problems because the benefits that were negotiated in collective bargaining at one point, once the industry changes and the revenue stream that supports that pension fund can't support it anymore. Baseball at this point doesn't have that problem. I know at one point in time there was concerns that the pension fund was in a problematic situation, but I found a copy of earlier this year, the current statement that was sent around to all the players. Forbes posted it on the website, and so one could take a look at that. It's very, very healthy, and certainly it seems to me that this could be addressed. Let me go back to Marvin Miller's situation, because from what I've read and thought about both this particular issue, the pension plan was a big point of contention in the early years of the union, and management, the owners didn't want to increase the payment into the pension plan, and so, that was kind of a critical component of the strikes. And to me, looking at that, the fact that the revenue stream increased a whole lot and the owner said, no, we want to keep that for ourselves. We don't want to give that to players, even though the original underlying creation of the revenue stream coming out of All-Star Game, et cetera, was specifically for that purpose. They wanted to go back and say, well, we don't think we want to do that to the same tune anymore. Was really again another example of a shameful way to treat the individuals who created all of this to begin with. So I think that they have the power to do certain things without automatically triggering exposure to things that they feel might go to the detriment of the entire plan. So I'm not sure if they told David Clyde, look, we're going to give you, we're going to address this. We're going to give you $10,000 a year. And that it's a true pension, which means that some of this can go to the heirs, that then a court, if it was looking at this, would say, oh, no, that litigation is really correct, and you need to make up all this money that was denied these players for that period of time. And I'm not sure that that's what most of the 500 or so who are left are really seeking. I think, to me, as an outsider reading and thinking about this, it seems that, first of all, they would like an admission made by the union and ownership that we didn't do what we should have done years ago. And the step that was made in 2011 is way short of what should have been the apology and what we should have done for these guys, particularly, who were union members at a time when the union was very weak, and it was their effort that helped change the game for the better of those players.
Let me ask you this, Professor. If collective bargaining doesn't work here, and Tony Clark and the Steve Rogers of the world, they don't answer this call because I have a call into them. No one gets back to me. I could say I'm an attorney. I could say I have my master's in tax. Even the IRS is on the side of amending a pension. Can we bring a class action suit under the ERISA doctrines and compel the pension administrator for Major League Baseball, through ERISA to do this?
I think that's a long shot compared to trying to do it through the collective bargaining process, but obviously there have been attempts to deal with this on the litigation side, and those have not been successful as far as what I've read and looked at.
Well, Professor, if I could interject for a moment, that 2003 litigation, Ian kind of alluded to it already. That was a dog to begin with. You can't cry racial discrimination when clearly so many of the pre-1980 players are African Americans and persons of color. The attorneys of record on that case, in my opinion, and I'm not an attorney, they didn't do their job. Now, employment law is different than Title VII of civil rights.
Very much so.
And I think that if you were to attack things from the perspective of employment law, again, I'm not an attorney. I'm going to defer to you on this. I think these guys have a way better chance than they did in 2003.
I think a different approach beyond Title VII. I would agree with that. But as your book points out, as we've talked about before, The duty of fair representation, the couple of cases that I teach about that in which union members have, sued the union over a breach of the duty of fair representation, courts, as they are with arbitration, are extraordinarily deferential. Mere negligence, for instance, that isn't enough to carry the day in a duty of fair representation case. So I've been struggling since Frank and I were on Ian's show before, trying to think about, well, what would be the best angle? Because the one thing about so many of the cases I teach, and I taught a class earlier today, and again, it was a situation where I asked my students, why is it that when judges get cases that deal with sports, they get outside of their normal comfort zone because they have this great love for sports, and instead of just looking at the underlying legal issues, they accept the values that supposedly sports stands for, and it often works against the litigant, particularly if the litigant here is one of these non-vested players against this enormous thing of baseball. So going all the way back to Kennesaw Mountain Landis and earlier, anything that strikes at the heart of baseball is a terrible blow. I find that problematic, but it's the thing that's difficult. So that is part of why I thought and said earlier that I think collective bargaining has potentially a better chance. Is collective bargaining is also given tremendous deference by the court. And I could see a court, if this was something that was negotiated in the collective bargaining process, I don't see how anybody could break that down. But obviously the problem is, without any leverage, and only the union is probably going to take this up as a high priority. And be successful. Right, management's not going to do this. The owners are not going to do this.
No, they don't have to.
So it's going to be completely on the Players Association to say, hey, look, we left out an important group. We've treated most everybody else really well. Why is this? What did this small group do to us that we don't want to take care of them? I'm mystified by that, but I also think, and I haven't necessarily answered the question here, but I think Marvin Miller, he had a priority list, I'm sure, in his mind of things that he needed to do, and this just didn't rise high enough. And I will say that from the period of 1968 up to 75, he made tremendous strides, but he certainly didn't cover everything. Historically, I think one can understand that in the labor relations. I don't think that means anything at all for 2017, where the union has now had, 40-some years of strength in which they could easily say, look, we're going to make this a priority.
Professor, like you, I've been, I went to law school and did my time. I've been practicing for 20 years. Most of what I do is tax, but when you go back in time, when, Brandeis, submitted the Brandeis brief in the 1908 case to the Supreme Court, that was the first really big brief that was based on facts rather than on law. So here, if Tony Clark and Steve Rogers and the union just brush this under and they don't go forward, we have 900, 400 of them are passed away, but I'm sure their families can tell the story. You know what Jimmy did with his first check? Jimmy, what'd you do with your first check from the Major League Baseball pension?
I filled up my oil tank to keep warm during the winter. I was glad to get it. You know, I'm certainly not going to send it back, but you know, the more I look at it, it's as Doug called it, it's a bone. It's a basic bone. And what really irked me was when they made this announcement that they were going to, you know, do something for our group, and Bud Selig strode up to the microphone and making the proclamation that we're taking care of our players, and they, you know, realizing that they not only hoodwinked us, they're taking out taxes even before they send the money to us. I mean, they've, you know, dipped to that low to do it. So, but yeah, I'm certainly not going to send the money back. The thing is, I mean, when Doug mentioned the billions of dollars, billions, I still love the game. I still love baseball. It was a tremendous World Series that I just got finished watching. The game is, the players have changed, the money has changed, but the game remains the same, a great game of baseball. And it ain't over till it's over, and Yogi was right. But the thing is, the money that's floating around now, that $5 million that Doug mentioned, that's cab money for some of those guys.
Each member of the Houston Astros, this year's World Series champs, who is voted a postseason share, they're likely to get $375,000 a man for a full share. All you need is 14 full shares to fund $5 million. The professor keeps saying it's a puzzlement, you know, not to sound like Yul Brynner. He's mystified. We're all mystified. And this time we don't have leverage. One of the things that irks me the most, if it weren't for podcasts like Ian's show and all the other podcasts I've done, Golenbach University, Mark and Mark, you know, on the Comfortably Zoned radio network, no scribe, no broadcast journalist wants to take this on. I think they're petrified of losing access. I don't understand it. If Woodward and Bernstein had been afraid to lose their access to government officials, Nixon could have gotten away with Watergate. You see, I'm still a baseball purist, gentlemen, but I'm also a journalism purist. And I really believe the fundamental mission of journalism is to educate and inform. And what these gutless turds, you heard me say it correctly, what these gutless turds, I have no respect for any of them for not writing about this.
Let me ask you, Professor. You present a brief just like you've heard. Jimmy Driscoll's putting oil in his tank. He's fixing his tank. You probably get about 900 other stories. You present the brief in district court, whatever it is. You know, 10th District Court, you got Ronald Dean, who has been practicing for the last 20-something years. He's a litigator, and he said, look, the ERISA doctrines can be amended. We can do this. My question to you is, the union don't act. Can we do something against Major League Baseball, then, if we can't get the union on our side?
My sense is that's a long shot, unfortunately. And I've been racking my brain for the last few weeks in particular trying to look at this and see, gee, what strategy would actually address this. But, I don't know that you could successfully go into court and force this the way that you could get it accomplished by collective bargaining. And unfortunately, for whatever reason, I think particularly as the book points out, they won't even talk about it. So it's like, well, why wouldn't you explain who would possibly lose anything by addressing this. That's, I think, is the thing that mystifies me the most, is why wouldn't you do this for players that you understand worked in an era when the amount that they were paid pales in comparison. And my own thing that I've worked on for a number of years, because I've watched and monitored the situation with the minor league players, that bothers me enormously as well. Why has basically the salaries for minor league players been stuck in place for 30 years? Why wouldn't management do something? Because the thing that I think is so perplexing is that a modest change to that would be appreciated and would certainly make everybody who knows those facts think, gee, there's some acceptance of the human dignity and the importance of these people who do this, that support the entire pipeline into the major leagues. I look at these players in a similar way and say, but for these guys, baseball isn't what it is today. It bothers me in the other sports as well. Football maybe has done a little bit better, but they've got their own set of different problems with the lack of guaranteed contracts and the severe physical toil that playing that game takes on players.
How about this?
The goodwill, the professor is absolutely correct. The goodwill that Tony Clark would be engendering would just be tremendous. And again, I said it before, I'll say it again. Don't understand how he looks himself in the mirror every day.
Well, two things, Doug and Professor and Jimmy, and then we'll all get a final argument, and we'll definitely have you three back on, because an hour is just not enough to go through this. And of course, an hour goes by fast. Everyone says, looks at me when I get them on the show, an hour? You sure you can talk an hour? I could talk 3, but that's a different story. Especially when it's a hot topic like this. Let me ask you something, Professor, and so that you can enlighten us, me, Doug, and Jimmy, and the rest of the listeners out here. Look, Kurt Flood, everyone knew the Supreme Court wasn't going to overturn the antitrust laws. You got former Supreme Court Justice Arthur Goldberg. They went to court. Flood lost. However, it opened up the fact that, hey, we're going to go a different route. Arbitration was the route. And, the good fortune of Marvin Miller to put arbitration on the table in '68 was huge, because in the end, Seitz voted. He was the tiebreaker. Free agency was allowed. Now, let me ask you this. 2 things. Even if we go to court, okay, and say we don't have a great chance of winning, we still got to overcome a summary judgment motion, which, again, for those who don't understand, summary judgment is a motion by either the plaintiff or the defendant to knock a court case out on the facts before it even gets to court in the pretrial motions and all the stuff building up to court. You got to overcome that. Then you go to district court, you lose. You appeals court, federal district. You appeal eventually to the Supreme Court. You're going to lose. However, even if we go that route, do you think we can report this to the National Labor Relations Board, saying that the union is ignoring this? Is there a way we can go through the National Labor Unions Board?
I think there might be a strategy there that would work. The NLRB is an interesting agency, quasi-judicial component in these kind of terms, because it renders opinions. It's a very political one, and it changes as the administration changes. And right now, I wouldn't think that the NLRB is going to be as sympathetic to labor side of the equation as it was under the past administration. So let me go back to something that obviously I've been working on for quite a few years. And it is interesting when I went on the internet with the inordinate amount of information that's available there, that I didn't find, as he said, I didn't find anybody championing the cause of these players. The information that I found was back, focused on the time when the book came out. So, current players probably in the 1990s or the 1980s didn't know who Curt Flood was. They don't know who Andy Messersmith is. They don't know who Dave McNally is. The public knows very little of the history of all of this. One thing that, I've spent my career trying to be an educator. I talk to students. I spend time in almost every class trying to tell them about who was involved in this litigation, what they did. Many of them, students just don't have any idea. The one thing this podcast tonight hopefully will do is that it will get a few people who didn't understand the nature of this situation to have a little better appreciation for it, and perhaps join on with some other people and say, look, let's do the right thing by these guys. And that's ultimately, I think, the biggest chance is to shame them into that. So I think the chapter where you talked about Dick Bainey going and trying to get some people at the All-Star game to just make people understand what happened and try to, in this era of social media, maybe that's the best chance at trying to do something, is to get people to understand what's going on, and that unfortunately these guys that group is in jeopardy of getting smaller every single day.
Jimmy, final thoughts.
Well, I'll tell you, it's been enlightening to me tonight as well to get some legal information and also some heartwarming information to let you guys know that not only myself but all the other players that are involved in this are appreciative of people going to bat for us. We're not the sharpest tools in the shed, but we were given a God-given ability to hit a baseball, a hand-eye coordination that we were born with, a gift from God Himself. You have it or you don't. You're born with it. You can't work hard to get it. We had it, and we went on that field, and we were enjoying ourselves. At least I was. I played 14 years of pro ball, mostly in the minors. I snuck up for what I thought was a cup of coffee, but as it turning out, it was a bitter cup of coffee and a apropos title to your book, Doug. But I'll tell you what, if there's light at the end of the tunnel, even the professor mentioned it's a long shot. Well, a long shot is a long shot, and if it comes down to push the shove, we'll take the long shot. What do we got to lose? We don't have nothing to lose, everything to gain. And again, it's been my pleasure to be part of this discussion, and hope to meet you guys in person someday, especially the professor.
That'd be very nice.
Cheer for old Notre Dame, one of my favorite fight songs since I was a kid.
That's it.
Anyway,
now. Go ahead, Jimmy. I'm sorry for interrupting.
Yeah. So again, thanks everybody, and hope to meet up again soon.
Hey, this is what I have to say. First of all, before I get to Doug and the professor and the final thoughts, without Jimmy Driscoll, this wouldn't be happening. Because Jimmy, I knew of what happened in 1980, but Jimmy's like, hey, Ian, did you ever read Doug Gladstone's book, Been a Cup of Coffee? I said, no, I didn't. So I reached out to Doug early in the year, and I ended up purchasing it on Amazon. We've had it, and things have spiraled from there. You had a domino effect. You had my other shows on the radio network, doing it on the Comfortably Zone radio network. So, Jimmy really spearheaded this by talking to me, and for everything there's a purpose in life, and you could attribute it to God, you could attribute it to faith, you could attribute it whatever. But it was Jimmy who got the ball rolling. Doug, final thoughts.
Well, as a journalist by trade, I just think I'm going to harken back to the first president and one of the founders of the Newspaper Guild, Haywood Hale Bruin, who, in my opinion, said it best. Sports doesn't build character, gentlemen. It reveals it. And what does that say about Tony Clark and the brass at the Major League Baseball Players Association?
Professor, final thoughts.
Well, I've enjoyed the opportunity to speak tonight, and I wish I had something that I thought could magically make this right. And I think, Doug is involved in a noble cause. Anybody who's listening to this and hasn't read the book, you quote so many of these players, and you feel, at least I do, tremendous empathy for them, because you'd like to think that a union that is there to serve players would do all the right things. I'm a pro player person. I tell my students at the very beginning of every semester, I can't expect management to do anything. These are owners that get taxpayers to take care of their biggest cost, which is building stadiums. I don't think you could expect them to do that, and I want to balance that by saying I know that there are owners that do some good things, but the Baseball Assistance Fund and the alumni groups, I would like to think that they would educate the players of today's game who are making really good money. Over $500,000 is a minimum salary. One thing we might return to at some point in the future is the union debate this year over capping the number of players who could come up for a small cup of coffee at the end of the year in the September call-up to add a 26th man to the roster. I think that's somewhat related to this conversation, because it ultimately has a lot to say about how many people get enough credited service and that obviously has changed. That a lot of guys did get their only credited service in Major League Baseball during that time frame. So thank very much for the opportunity, and I wish I thought there was a quick legal solution here, but I think ultimately it's based upon some people saying, look, we have the power in our hands to right a wrong that we think was done to these players, and it's high time we just set about finding the way to do it.
Gentlemen, it was a pleasure dealing with all three of you. Hang on the line. I'm going to end the show, and then I'll spend about a minute or so talking to each one of you. Folks, this is a very important issue. This is another show I've had with Mr. Gladstone on. The network is pulling for him. Hal Bach wrote an article. Word is getting out. And what I'd like all of you to do after you listen to this podcast, I know there are many who listen to it because I got 50,000 followers, and I always get compliments on my show. Do the research. See the injustice that has gone on for the last 37 years and see how it's ignored. Make decisions. Maybe I'll get a running petition going to Tony Clark. If we can't go to court, I'm still not convinced that that's not an option. But, there's so many different things we could do here. Let's get the word out. Part of Marvin Miller's genius was to work the press, work the public, get people angry about this. see the injustice, share the wealth that Major League Baseball has. These guys like Jimmy put their whole careers on the line by going on strike, not getting paid, paving the way for what we know of baseball today. As always, I'm Ian Kahanowitz. You are listening to the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. Thank you, gentlemen, and in the immortal words of Edward R. Murrow, good night, folks. Good luck. We'll see you next time.